What did it mean to wake up ordinary on the very edge of an empire that ruled 3 continents? This story follows one quiet, unremarkable day in the life of a modest family living on the distant outskirts of the Ottoman Empire. There are no sultans here, no grand palaces, no battles or proclamations. Instead, there is dust on the road, bread cooling at dawn, the slow rhythm of work, prayer, hunger, warmth, and fatigue. Across 33 parts, this single day unfolds hour by hour, from the pale light before sunrise to the deep stillness of night, revealing how empire was experienced not through power, but through routine. This is a story about survival, habit, and the unnoticed weight of history pressing gently on ordinary lives. Long before the sun reached the low hills beyond the settlement, the house was already awake in the quiet way that did not require sound. The dwelling stood at the outer edge of the village, where cultivated land gave way to scrub and stone. Its walls were built from sun-dried mud brick, uneven and softened by years of wind and rain. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of packed earth and wooden beams that had been replaced more than once. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of ash, wool, and yesterday's bread. The family slept together in one main room, not from closeness but from necessity. Thick woven mats covered the floor, layered with worn blankets that had been patched so many times their original colors were no longer clear. In the dim light before dawn, shapes were barely distinguishable, the slow rise and fall of breathing, a hand resting on fabric, a foot pressed against the wall for warmth. Outside, the settlement remained still. No call to prayer had yet broken the silence, and the animals tethered nearby shifted only occasionally, their movements muted by the cool air. Somewhere beyond the houses, a dog moved through the darkness, unseen and unconcerned. The man of the household stirred first, as he always did. Years of labor had trained his body to wake before light, before thought. His joints ached slightly, as they did every morning, but the pain was familiar and therefore unremarkable. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the others, and wrapped a rough cloak around his shoulders. The floor beneath his feet was cold. He paused briefly, listening to the quiet, measuring the time not by clocks but by instinct. This was the hour when the world felt suspended, neither asleep nor awake, when the empire itself seemed distant and abstract, existing somewhere far beyond the hills and roads that defined his life. In the corner of the room, embers still glowed faintly from the previous night. He stirred them gently, adding a small piece of wood saved precisely for this moment. The fire responded slowly, a dim orange pulse pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal the walls and the familiar cracks running through them. As the faint light grew, the rest of the household began to shift. Not fully awake, not fully asleep, they moved as parts of a long-practiced routine. The day had begun, not with intention, but with inevitability. Outside, the sky remained dark, but its color had begun to change. The sky changed almost imperceptibly at first, the black thinning into a deep blue that pressed gently against the horizon. This was the moment when night loosened its hold without fully releasing the world beneath it. The house, still dim, responded to the shift as if it could sense the coming light through its walls. The woman rose next, her movements practiced and quiet. Sleep left her body reluctantly, clinging to her shoulders and limbs, but responsibility pulled her upright before her thoughts could settle. She wrapped a scarf around her hair, smoothing it into place out of habit rather than concern for appearance. Even in the privacy of the home, order mattered. She knelt near the fire, coaxing it into steadier life. The flames flickered low and patient, warming the room just enough to soften the chill that lingered from the night. A clay pot was set beside the embers, filled with water drawn the evening before. Soon it would be warm enough to wash hands, to prepare the first food of the day. The children remained mostly still, their breathing slow and uneven. They lay tangled in blankets, limbs overlapping in ways that would later cause complaints, but now passed unnoticed. Youth allowed them a deeper rest, even when sleep came on rough mats and beneath thin coverings. Their dreams, if they had any, were unrecorded and unimportant to the rhythm of the day. Outside, the first sounds of waking life appeared cautiously. A rooster called from somewhere within the village, its voice sharp in the quiet air. Another answered from farther away, creating a brief exchange that faded as quickly as it began. Somewhere nearby, a donkey stamped once, irritated by a fly that had risen early. The man stepped outside briefly, pulling the door closed behind him with care. The ground beneath his feet was uneven and cool, packed earth hardened by countless footsteps. He looked eastward, toward land that stretched far beyond his knowledge, beyond maps he had never seen. The Empire ruled these lands, but its presence was felt here only in distant ways, through taxes collected once a year, through laws spoken by others, through soldiers who rarely came this far unless something had gone wrong. The air smelled of damp soil and smoke drifting from other homes beginning their morning routines. Thin columns of smoke rose across the settlement, each one marking a household repeating the same actions, bound together not by conversation but by necessity. When he returned inside, the light had grown enough to reveal more detail. The walls showed their stains and cracks clearly now, each mark a quiet record of seasons past. A bundle of tools rested against one side of the room, arranged carefully despite their wear. A loaf of bread, baked the day before, sat wrapped in cloth, its surface already hardening. The woman tore pieces from the loaf and set them near the fire to soften. This was not a meal so much as a preparation for endurance. Food here was measured not by pleasure, but by how long it allowed the body to keep moving. As the children finally stirred, rubbing their eyes and shifting into sitting positions, the house filled with subtle motion. No one spoke. Words were unnecessary at this hour. The day unfolded without announcement, shaped by light, hunger, and the quiet understanding that everything would proceed as it always had. Beyond the doorway, the sun approached the edge of the world, unseen but inevitable. By the time the sun finally lifted above the low hills, its light entered the house indirectly, reflected from the pale ground outside rather than shining through any opening. The doorway faced away from the sunrise, a small accident of construction that had never been corrected. Light arrived slowly here, diffused and gentle, revealing the room without warmth. The family moved with greater purpose now. Sleep had retreated fully, replaced by the steady awareness of tasks that could not be delayed. The man checked the simple tools laid out along the wall, selecting those needed for the fields beyond the settlement. Their handles were smooth from use, darkened by years of sweat and oil. Each tool had been repaired more than once, reshaped to survive rather than replaced. The woman measured grain carefully, pouring it into a shallow stone vessel. There was no excess, no uncertainty about amounts. Every portion had already been decided long before this morning, shaped by past harvests and the knowledge of how long stores must last. She added water, stirring slowly, letting the mixture rest while the fire strengthened beneath it. The children washed their hands and faces with water that still held a trace of cold. They shivered briefly, then grew still, accepting discomfort without comment. Their clothes were simple and worn thin at the edges, adjusted over time as bodies grew. What could not be mended was reinforced, and what could not be reinforced was accepted as temporary. Outside, the village had fully awakened. Footsteps passed along the narrow path, not hurried, but constant. The sounds of labor replaced the silence of dawn, wood being moved, doors opening, animals being led from their enclosures. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck metal, its rhythm uneven but determined. The man stepped outside again, this time with purpose. He adjusted the strap across his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight settle against his back. The path ahead was known intimately, each stone and bend memorized through repetition rather than thought. He would walk it without effort, leaving and returning as he had done for years. Inside, the woman portioned the softened bread and thickened grain into small amounts. The food was eaten standing or sitting on the floor, never lingering long enough to invite rest. Nourishment here marked the beginning of work, not a pause before it. The children finished quickly, wiping their hands on their clothing. One gathered a small bundle prepared for the day, while another lingered near the doorway, watching the outside world with quiet curiosity. Their responsibilities were lighter than those of the adults, but not insignificant. Even youth was folded into the labor of survival. As the man stepped fully into the morning, the the sun now clear and rising, the house returned briefly to stillness. Smoke drifted upward in a thin line, and the door remained open just long enough for light to reach the far wall. The day had fully begun, carrying the family forward without waiting for permission. The path leading away from the house curved gently around the outermost dwellings of the settlement, narrowing as it left the cluster of homes behind. It had never been planned or measured. It existed because feet had worn it into the earth over generations, compressing soil and stone into something reliable through repetition alone. The man walked steadily, his pace unhurried but purposeful. The morning air carried a thin warmth now, enough to loosen stiffness in the body without offering comfort. With each step, the sounds of the village softened behind him, replaced by the quieter language of open land, wind brushing dry grass, insects beginning their day, the distant movement of grazing animals. Fields stretched outward in uneven patches, their boundaries marked by low stones or simple wooden stakes. The land here was stubborn, yielding only when treated with patience and persistence. It bore little resemblance to the fertile plains spoken of in distant markets, yet it sustained those who knew how to work it. The soil showed signs of recent tending, shallow furrows catching the light at sharp angles. Elsewhere, other figures moved through the landscape, spaced far apart but connected by shared labor. Each person followed their own route, carrying tools shaped for similar tasks. There was no need for acknowledgement. Presence alone was enough to confirm belonging. Back at the house, the woman gathered what remained from the morning meal. Nothing was discarded. Crumbs were brushed carefully into a cloth, later to be mixed with water or fed to animals. The fire was reduced, not extinguished, left alive enough to be coaxed again without waste. She stepped outside briefly, scanning the sky and the direction of the wind, registering changes without naming them. The children drifted toward their tasks, moving between home and settlement with growing independence. One followed the edge of the path, tracing familiar marks in the dust with a stick. Another lingered near the animals, observing their habits with quiet fascination. Learning here came not through instruction, but through proximity. As the sun climbed higher, its light sharpened. Shadows shortened, retreating beneath walls and bodies. Heat gathered slowly, settling into stone and earth. This was the part of the day when effort mattered most, when the work done would determine the ease or hardship of the hours to come. Far beyond the fields, unseen and unconsidered, officials recorded numbers and collected reports, maintaining the structure of an empire that barely touched this land. Here, authority existed more in habit than enforcement. The rhythm of labor governed life more strictly than any distant decree. The path remained quiet after the man passed, holding the impression of his steps only briefly before wind and time softened them away. Nothing here announced importance. Yet everything done this morning would echo into the evening, shaping the rest that might or might not come. The sun continued its slow ascent, indifferent and reliable. By mid-morning, the sun had taken its place above the land with quiet authority. Its warmth was no longer tentative. It pressed steadily against skin and cloth, drawing moisture from the earth and from the bodies that moved across it. The fields responded with subtle changes, scents grew stronger, colors sharpened, and the ground hardened beneath repeated steps. The man worked methodically, his movements economical and restrained. Each motion followed another without hesitation, guided by long familiarity rather than thought. The tool rose and fell in a measured rhythm, breaking soil that resisted just enough to demand attention. Sweat gathered slowly along his back and temples, unnoticed until it cooled in brief moments of stillness. Around him, the landscape offered no distractions. The horizon remained distant and unchanging, broken only by low hills and scattered trees that provided little shade. The work required focus not because it was complex, but because stopping would invite fatigue too early in the day. Endurance here depended on pacing rather than strength. Elsewhere, the woman tended to tasks closer to the house. She moved between spaces with deliberate calm, carrying water, adjusting stored goods, checking what had been left to dry or rest. Each action served a purpose, though none demanded urgency. The household existed in a fragile balance, maintained through attention to small details that could not be neglected. She paused briefly to mend a tear in fabric, her fingers guiding the thread with practiced precision. The cloth was thin, softened by years of washing and wear, but it still held. Nothing was truly new here. Objects remained in use until they surrendered completely, and even then their remnants found other purposes. The children, now fully absorbed in their own movements, mirrored the world around them. One followed animals along the edge of the settlement, learning their paths and moods through observation alone. Another assisted where needed, carrying small loads or watching over items placed in the sun. Their tasks were light, but their presence mattered. Through them, the routines of the household stretched forward into the future. The sounds of labor blended into a low, continuous murmur across the land. Tools struck earth, feet shifted, birds called from a distance. None of it demanded attention, yet together it formed the steady pulse of the day. This was the sound of survival proceeding as expected. As the sun climbed higher, the promise of heat ahead became unavoidable. The morning offered no relief, only the opportunity to prepare for what would follow. Every action now aimed to make the later hours bearable. Time moved without ceremony, measured only by the position of light and the gradual weariness in muscle and bone. The empire remained far away, its reach invisible in this moment. What mattered was the ground beneath the hands, the sky above, and the work that could not wait. As the sun approached its highest point, the air thickened. Heat settled heavily over the land, pressing downward without movement or sound. Shadows withdrew to their smallest forms, clinging closely to walls, stones, and the bodies that cast them. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though unwilling to disturb the stillness. In the fields, the man adjusted his pace. The work did not stop, but it changed character, becoming slower and more deliberate. Each movement carried greater effort now, each breath drawn with awareness. Sweat no longer cooled the skin, it lingered, soaking into cloth and drying unevenly under the sun's steady gaze. He paused briefly, straightening his back and scanning the land ahead. There was no sign to read, no signal to mark progress beyond the subtle transformation of the soil beneath his feet. The task advanced not through visible achievement, but through endurance. Near the house, the woman sought shade where it could be found. She arranged her work to remain within the shelter of walls or low overhangs, conserving energy for the long afternoon ahead. Water was handled with care, each vessel returned to its place, each drop accounted for. Thirst was acknowledged but controlled. Inside the house, the air grew still and dim, the thick walls offering some protection from the heat. Light entered only in narrow bands, tracing slow paths across the floor. The fire had been reduced to embers, barely alive, waiting patiently for evening. The children retreated indoors or into shallow shade, their earlier movement giving way to quiet observation. They rested not by sleeping, but by becoming still, letting time pass over them without resistance. Even rest required discipline in these hours. Beyond the settlement, distant roads lay empty under the sun. Travelers, if any moved at all, did so sparingly, aware of the cost of exposure. This was not the hour for journeys or decisions. It was the hour to endure. Overhead, the sky showed no variation. It offered no clouds, no relief, only a wide, unbroken blue that emphasized the smallness of all life beneath it. The empire's reach extended across this sky, at least in name, yet it provided no shelter here. The man returned slowly toward the settlement as the day demanded a pause. His steps were heavier now, his shoulders stiff beneath the weight of tools and heat. Each step raised a small cloud of dust that settled almost immediately, as though the ground itself were tired of motion. Midday passed not as a moment, but as a condition, something to be endured rather than marked. The world waited in place, holding its breath until the sun began its gradual descent. When the sun finally began its slow movement away from its highest point, the change was subtle but deeply felt. The air remained hot, yet the pressure eased slightly, as though the world had released a held breath. Shadows stretched just enough to become noticeable again, lengthening along the ground in thin, uncertain lines. The man rested briefly at the edge of the settlement before resuming lighter tasks. His body responded cautiously, testing the returning balance between effort and exhaustion. Muscles still burned, but the worst strain had passed. The remaining work required attention rather than force, and he moved with renewed patience. Nearby, others emerged from shelter, drawn out by the promise of tolerable heat. Movement returned gradually, not in bursts but in careful increments. The land accepted this renewed activity without response, offering neither resistance nor reward. At the house, the woman prepared for the evening hours. She checked what had been drying in the sun, turning items to ensure even exposure before the light faded. She gathered small bundles and placed them where they would be needed later, arranging the space with an eye toward efficiency rather than comfort. Inside, the children shifted from stillness to quiet motion. They watched the light change across the walls, noting its progress without naming it. One traced patterns in the dust with a fingertip, erasing them just as carefully, while another leaned against the cool interior wall, feeling the difference between shadow and warmth. The village itself seemed to awaken a second time, slower and more deliberate than the morning. Footsteps returned to the paths, voices carried briefly before fading again, and animals stirred, sensing the approach of feeding and rest. The afternoon did not demand urgency, only attention. The man crossed the familiar path once more, this time with lighter burdens. His tools rested easier against his side, and his pace reflected the day's gradual release. The sun, now lower, caught the dust in the air, turning it golden for a moment before it settled back into the earth. Nothing in this hour was dramatic. No events marked it as special or worthy of record. Yet this was the time when balance returned, when the day shifted from survival toward completion. What remained to be done would be done, not hurried, not delayed. The light softened as it moved westward, touching walls, fields, and faces with equal indifference. The empire remained distant and unchanged, but here, at the edge of its reach, the day began to lean toward rest. As the sun lowered further, the quality of light changed again, becoming warmer and less severe. The harsh brightness of midday softened into long, slanting rays that touched the land gently, revealing textures overlooked in the stronger light. Cracks in the earth, worn edges of stone, and the grain of wood all became briefly more visible, as if the day were offering a quiet summary of itself. The woman returned fully to the center of the household's activity. She gathered fuel carefully, selecting pieces that would burn steadily rather than quickly. The fire was revived with deliberate restraint, coaxed back into life without waste. Smoke rose in a thin, controlled line, carrying the scent of evening into the air. Food preparation resumed with familiar efficiency. What remained from stores was combined thoughtfully, measured not only by hunger but by foresight. The meal would be simple, as it always was, designed to sustain rather than satisfy. Each step followed the last in a sequence learned through repetition rather than instruction. The man arrived as the shadows lengthened noticeably. His movements slowed as he crossed the threshold, the transition from open land to enclosed space bringing immediate relief. He set aside his tools with care, placing them where they could dry and cool before the next day. The weight of labor remained in his body, but it no longer demanded attention. The children gathered near the fire, drawn by its warmth and movement. They watched the flames without focus, letting their minds rest. The day's lessons had been absorbed without effort, through observation and imitation rather than explanation. Outside, the settlement prepared collectively for night. Animals were guided back toward their enclosures, their paths guided by habit rather than command. The sounds of the village shifted again, becoming softer and more contained. Movement remained, but it no longer stretched outward into the land. The sky above began its slow transformation, pale blue giving way to deeper tones. The sun hovered just above the horizon, its light slipping between distant hills and low structures. For a brief moment, the world seemed suspended between heat and cool, work and rest. The empire's presence remained abstract, unspoken, yet it shaped even this hour. The timing of labor, the necessity of self-reliance, the quiet acceptance of limits, all were shaped by systems far beyond the family's awareness. Yet here, in this small space, life narrowed to fire, food, and the promise of rest. The evening settled gently, without ceremony. The day, nearly complete, prepared to release its hold. As the afternoon aged, the light grew warmer in color and less severe in weight. Shadows returned fully now, stretching outward from walls, trees, and bodies, reclaiming ground that had been lost to the sun hours earlier. The land appeared calmer beneath this shifting balance, as though it, too, had endured enough. The man approached the house at an unremarkable pace, his steps no longer measured by labor but by familiarity. Dust clung to his clothing and skin, forming a thin record of the day's work. He set his tools down in their usual place, aligning them carefully, an act that required no thought yet offered quiet order. The woman acknowledged the change in light immediately. She adjusted her movements to match it, bringing water closer, preparing the fire for its return. Small pieces of wood were selected with care, chosen not for size but for how they would burn. Efficiency here meant warmth later. Inside, the house welcomed the evening slowly. The air cooled first near the floor, then along the walls, while the center of the room held the day's heat longer. Light entered at a lower angle now, illuminating surfaces that had remained untouched all day. The familiar space seemed briefly unfamiliar under this altered glow. The children moved closer together, drawn inward by instinct as much as habit. Their energy had softened, shaped by heat and time. They watched the preparations without interference, understanding when presence was acceptable and when it was not. Outside, the settlement entered its gentlest phase. Animals were guided back toward enclosures, their movements unresistant. The paths filled briefly, then emptied again as people returned to their homes. The world narrowed once more, retreating from open land into enclosed spaces. The sky showed its first signs of change. The blue deepened, losing its earlier intensity, and the edges of clouds far away caught faint color. Evening announced itself not through sound, but through sensation, cooler air, slower motion, and the gradual easing of strain. The empire remained present only as a distant certainty, unchanged by the turning of this small day. Here, the approaching evening mattered more than any decree or boundary. The fire came back to life softly, its glow steady and controlled. The house settled around it, gathering warmth as night prepared its slow arrival. As the sun continued its descent, shadows reclaimed the ground they had abandoned at midday. They stretched across paths and fields, softening the sharp lines carved by light and heat. The air cooled gradually, not enough to bring comfort, but enough to allow the body to release its guarded tension. The man approached the house with a steadier step now, the rhythm of work finally loosening its grip. Dust clung to his clothing and skin, a fine layer that marked the hours spent under open sky. He paused briefly at the threshold, not to rest, but to adjust himself to the quieter space within. Inside, the woman had already begun shaping the evening from what the day had provided. She moved calmly, drawing water, arranging vessels, preparing what little would be shared later. The fire was coaxed back into life with careful attention, fed just enough to glow steadily without wasting fuel. Smoke curled upward, slow and familiar. The children drifted closer to the center of the house, their energy subdued by the long day. They watched the fire awaken, its light shifting across their faces and the walls behind them. Evening always carried a subtle change in mood, a soft boundary between effort and release that even they could sense. Outside, the village responded in quiet harmony. Animals were gathered and secured, tools leaned against walls, paths cleared of passing feet. The sounds of movement blended into a low murmur, then thinned as each household turned inward. The sky deepened in color, blue fading toward amber and gray. Birds crossed overhead in loose formations, returning to unseen resting places beyond the settlement. Their passage went mostly unnoticed, another rhythm layered into the familiar pattern of days. The empire, vast and enduring, moved through its own evening elsewhere, decisions made, records kept, orders written, but none of that reached this house. Here, time narrowed to the space enclosed by walls, firelight, and the slow settling of bodies tired from labor. As darkness approached, the final tasks of the day took shape. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was delayed. The day, having demanded its due, now prepared to withdraw quietly. As the sun sank lower toward the horizon, the landscape shifted in tone. Shadows stretched long and thin across the fields, bending around stones, fences, and low walls. The air, once heavy and pressing, had begun to cool, carrying a subtle relief that suggested evening might soon arrive. The man moved steadily back toward the house, carrying tools now lighter in both weight and significance. The labor of the day had been accomplished, though not fully complete. There were always small tasks that lingered, waiting for the mind to remember them. Still, the urgency had faded, replaced by a contemplative rhythm as he navigated the familiar path. Near the edges of the settlement, children wandered in small arcs, curious about the changes in light and temperature. Their play was quiet, almost ceremonial, measured against the backdrop of daily routine rather than instinctive mischief. They traced lines in the dust, gathered small stones, or examined the edges of the fields where soil had dried and cracked under the sun. These small actions marked time as much as any clock or sundial could. The woman remained near the doorway, organizing the last of the day's provisions and tending to minor chores that had accumulated during the hours of heat. Her movements were smooth and deliberate, shaped by countless repetitions over years of practice. She folded cloth, swept dust into small piles, and arranged food in ways that preserved it for the coming night. Each action was small, almost invisible, yet each carried weight, ensuring the household could continue into the hours of darkness. Animals began to respond to the fading heat, their movements slower and more deliberate. Chickens scratched quietly near the edges of the yard, and the donkey lowered its head to nibble on sparse grass. Their presence was both comforting and grounding, a reminder of continuity that extended beyond human effort. The first hints of the evening breeze carried the smell of distant fires and damp soil, signaling the slow return of life to the settlement after the harshness of midday. Windows and doors remained open where possible, allowing the cool air to enter and mingle with the warmth retained inside walls. The empire, immense and ever-present in name, seemed irrelevant in this small corner. Authority existed only in distant edicts, and life progressed according to the natural order of light, labor, and rest. The family felt this order intimately, moving with it rather than against it, bound by the rhythms of the day rather than the ambitions of rulers. As the sun touched the tops of the hills, casting a warm amber glow, the household began to prepare for the slower pace that night would bring. Movement slowed, muscles relaxed, and the quiet understanding of completion settled into the space around them. The day, long and steady, had begun its descent toward rest, leaving behind traces in dust, sweat, and the soft impressions of footsteps across the earth. With the sun nearing the horizon, the world took on a muted glow, softening harsh edges and smoothing the sharp contrasts of the day. The fields appeared warmer, dustier, and yet somehow calmer, as though the earth itself had exhaled after the pressure of midday. The wind, previously still, began to stir gently, carrying faint scents of soil, wood smoke, and distant vegetation. The man moved back into the house gradually, the weight of labor replaced by a slower, more measured rhythm. Each step was deliberate, informed by weariness and the awareness of nearing the end of the day. He carried with him tools cleaned and set aside, their surfaces dulled by use but polished by care. The routine of storing them had become almost ceremonial, a daily acknowledgement of the day's effort. The woman adjusted the final tasks for the evening. She tidied the cooking area, stacking pots and smoothing cloths over stored grains and vegetables. Each small motion seemed amplified by the lowering light, the shadows stretching and leaning over the objects as if to linger upon them. Her hands moved with the precision of habit, though her thoughts were quieter now, less tethered to preparation than earlier hours. Children wandered more freely in the yard, their energy tempered by the lengthening shadows. One paused to observe the animals settling for the night, another ran fingers over the cool walls of the house, tracing familiar patterns. The world was familiar to them, shaped by repetition, yet in this gentle light it seemed subtly different, softer, more forgiving, hinting at quiet wonder without words. The village itself exhaled along with the family. Fires began to smoke gently in courtyards, doors closed more fully, and the sounds of labor faded into the distant murmur of evening. Birds returned to roost, their calls now brief and subdued, echoing faintly across the fields. Even the wind seemed to carry less insistence, moving slowly through the grasses and along the stone paths. The family's routines converged in these final hours of light. Food was prepared simply, portions shared with quiet attention, not abundance. Water was collected, tools were placed with care, and the fire was allowed to die down to embers, leaving warmth without risk. Each action was purposeful but unhurried, a bridge between the effort of the day and the stillness of night. Outside, the empire remained invisible, its authority only a distant murmur. Here, life was measured in rhythms of labor, observation, and survival. The ordinary day continued to assert its presence, unremarkable yet complete, in the small household that inhabited its edge. As the sky shifted toward the colors of dusk, the family paused to feel the change, acknowledging without words the passing of time, the conclusion of effort, and the approach of night. The day, in all its ordinary persistence, was drawing to a close. As dusk approached, the colors of the sky deepened, shifting from amber and gold to soft pinks and muted purples. Light lingered over the landscape, brushing walls and fields with a gentle, forgiving glow. Shadows stretched long across the uneven ground, revealing textures that had been hidden throughout the day, the roughness of mud brick, the curves of worn stone, the faint impressions of footsteps left in dust. The man sat briefly outside the house, letting his body recover from the steady work of the day. His hands, calloused and marked by labor, rested on his knees. Even in stillness, he remained attentive to the land, noting the position of the sun, the distant shapes of animals returning to shelter, the quiet stirrings of neighbors finishing their tasks. Observation had become as important as action, a way to measure time and anticipate the rhythm of night. Inside, the woman moved slowly, finishing preparations for the evening meal. The fire, now reduced to glowing embers, cast a warm, flickering light that illuminated the room with a soft intimacy. She arranged the remaining food, ensuring that portions were balanced, and that nothing would go to waste. Each gesture was precise, almost meditative, as though the care itself provided a quiet satisfaction independent of necessity. The children lingered nearby, drawn to the gentle light and subtle warmth of the fire. They moved cautiously, aware of the fragile boundary between day and night, between motion and stillness. One brushed dust from the floor with careful, repeated strokes, another tended to a small bundle of kindling left for the next morning. Their attention to these small details mirrored the lessons they absorbed through silent observation, that life was constructed from effort, awareness, and care. Outside, the village softened into quietness. Footsteps faded into distant echoes along the paths, doors closed with gentle thuds, and animals settled into their nocturnal rhythms. The air cooled further, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and distant smoke. The wind whispered softly through the grasses and trees, harmonizing with the muted sounds of life winding down. The empire remained a distant abstraction, its authority present in name only, almost irrelevant to the immediate rhythm of this household. Life here was dictated by light, labor, and necessity, and by the intimate, unspoken understanding among those who shared this space. History pressed on quietly, shaping lives in ways unseen yet undeniable. As the sky darkened further, the family gathered near the fire, their movements slower, more deliberate. The day's work was behind them, leaving only the quiet reflection of effort well spent. The last embers glowed warmly, casting long, soft shadows that danced gently across walls, floor, and faces. The ordinary day had reached its end, yielding space for the approaching night. Twilight deepened, and the sky transformed into a gradient of indigo and soft violet. The first stars appeared, faint at first, then gradually more numerous, as if the world were filling slowly with distant lights. Shadows merged into one another, folding the house, yard, and fields into a muted, unified shape. The boundary between day and night became less distinct, a gentle transition rather than a sudden change. The man remained near the doorway, his body relaxed but alert. He watched the subtle movements of the household and the surrounding settlement, noting the flicker of fires in neighboring homes, the cautious movement of animals finding their night spaces, and the distant shapes of villagers returning from late tasks. Each observation was absorbed quietly, a silent mapping of the world in preparation for the night. The woman moved methodically, finishing minor chores indoors. Cloths were folded, dishes stacked, and the fire left as a small, steady ember to maintain warmth. She performed these actions not out of urgency, but from the continuity of habit, each gesture affirming the rhythms of life, the household's order, and the quiet completion of daily routines. The children, no longer moving with the energy of the day, settled into corners of the room, quietly observing the space, the firelight, and the adults' movements. Their eyes reflected the glow, a mixture of curiosity, weariness, and understanding that the day had reached its natural conclusion. Lessons were absorbed silently, through sight, touch, and rhythm, rather than through speech. Outside, the air cooled further, carrying the faint scent of earth, wood, and distant smoke. Wind stirred gently, rustling grasses and the edges of the settlement, yet nothing moved in urgency. The village existed in this hour as a collection of quiet presences, each occupying space without disruption. Even the animals were hushed, breathing rhythmically, shifting occasionally but largely motionless. The empire's reach, though vast, seemed irrelevant in this soft hour. Governance and edicts mattered little here, where the persistence of routine and care determined the survival of a household. The daily labor had been its own authority, and the setting sun marked its close with quiet, inexorable logic. As light continued to fade, the family paused to feel the gentle coolness and the peace of completion. The day's work, the routine of labor, observation, and care, had carried them to this moment. The household had endured, adapted, and persisted, unremarkable to anyone beyond these walls, yet entirely consequential within them. The last hues of twilight faded, leaving the world in the soft, enveloping embrace of approaching night. Night settled gradually, carrying with it a coolness that contrasted sharply with the day's lingering warmth. The sky, deep and expansive, revealed clusters of stars more clearly now, their distant light flickering with subtle irregularity. The horizon became a faint, dark line, separating earth from sky, holding the settlement in a quiet embrace. The man moved within the house with deliberate calm. Tools and belongings had been put away, and his work for the day had ceased. He paused by the doorway, listening to the subtle sounds of night, the occasional low cry of an animal, the soft rustling of grasses in the wind, the distant hum of other households settling. Each sound was absorbed, catalogued silently, a quiet measure of place and time. The woman remained near the hearth, tending to the last embers and arranging simple provisions for the following day. She moved carefully, each gesture guided by habit and the understanding that night required preparation, yet demanded little exertion. The warmth of the dying fire provided comfort, softening shadows that leaned against walls and floors. The children, now fully still, observed without speaking, learning in quiet ways that did not require instruction. Their eyes reflected the dim firelight and the silver glow of the stars beyond. The boundary between action and rest had been crossed, and even small movements carried the weight of consideration. Outside, the settlement had hushed further. Paths lay empty, fires burned low, and animals slept. Only the faintest noises, an insect moving, a distant bird, the whisper of wind through trees, punctuated the night's quiet. The world seemed to contract, drawing inward around the household, emphasizing their small presence in the vastness of land and sky. The empire, immense and abstract, remained invisible. It existed only in the unspoken rules and occasional distant edicts, irrelevant to the immediate experience of heat, cold, light, and shadow. Here, life was governed by daily routine, by care, observation, and endurance, and night confirmed the boundaries of survival more than any law. The family moved slowly toward the places where they would rest. Each action was measured, each step conscious of the transition from labor to repose. The fire's glow faded gradually, leaving only warmth and memory, its last light tracing walls and objects before succumbing to darkness. Night had arrived fully. The ordinary household, having endured the day's demands, settled into quiet stillness, marking the unremarkable yet essential rhythm of life at the edge of the empire. The night grew denser, stretching across the land in a vast, unbroken canopy of darkness. Stars twinkled faintly, distant and untouchable, while the wind whispered gently through the fields, bending grasses and stirring the few remaining leaves. The air cooled further, carrying with it the scent of earth, dust, and the faint smoke of dying fires from other households in the settlement. Inside the house, the family lay mostly still. The man rested against a woven mat, body heavy with the day's labor, yet alert to small sounds, the shift of a blanket, the soft breathing of children, the occasional scrape of a creature outside. His senses remained quietly tuned to the household, a subtle vigilance shaped by habit and necessity. The woman moved minimally, arranging blankets and smoothing mats for comfort. Each movement was precise, conserving energy while ensuring the household remained orderly. She checked the fire one last time, ensuring embers would not die entirely, leaving a faint warmth to carry through the cooler hours. Her hands lingered briefly on the edge of the hearth, noting the subtle heat before withdrawing. The children slept in their small corner, bodies curled against one another, their faces softened by the dim glow of embers. Even in sleep, they were part of the household's rhythm, their presence accounted for in the quiet choreography of night. Outside, the world had slowed almost entirely. Occasional animals moved stealthily, barely disturbing the hush. A distant dog barked once, fading quickly into silence. The wind shifted direction, a gentle reminder that nature persisted independently of human efforts. The settlement, in all its clustered simplicity, was enveloped in quiet. Time became less measurable here. Without the sun to mark hours, life relied on internal rhythms, the slow cooling of the air, the gradual deepening of shadows, the faint movements of the household. This was a different kind of awareness, one that required patience and attentiveness without urgency. The empire, vast and powerful in distant lands, held no tangible presence in this darkness. Authority here existed in the knowledge of routines, in the understanding of resources, and in the quiet endurance of the household. Survival was measured not by law, but by attention, by care, and by consistency. As the night pressed on, the family remained settled, wrapped in blankets and silence, carried through hours that would pass unnoticed yet completely. The ordinary day had ended, yet its imprint remained, in the weariness of bodies, the positions of objects, and the subtle warmth left behind by fire and effort. The household lay under the blanket of deep night, its movements minimal, measured, almost imperceptible. Only the faintest sounds marked existence, the slow, steady breathing of the man, the occasional shuffle of a blanket as the children adjusted in their sleep, the soft rustle of the woman's hands smoothing folds of cloth. Each motion was deliberate, cautious, honoring the silence that enveloped them. Outside, the settlement rested under the pale light of distant stars. The wind stirred sporadically, carrying the scents of dry earth, faint smoke, and the lingering warmth of the sun-soaked day. Trees and shrubs shifted gently, their shadows stretching across the dust and stones like thin fingers, almost alive in their subtle, dark movements. The man shifted slightly, stretching muscles stiff from the day's labor. Even in the absence of urgency, the body responded to its routines, echoing the day's effort. His hands rested briefly on the mat, feeling the uneven surface beneath him, then returned to stillness. Awareness persisted quietly, a watchfulness born of habit rather than fear. The woman moved with minimal effort, attending to a small task near the hearth. She collected any remaining embers, arranging them to maintain a subtle warmth, then replaced pots and tools in their habitual places. Each motion was methodical, conserving energy, acknowledging the day's end, and preserving readiness for the following morning. The children, their sleep deepening, occasionally shifted or murmured softly, returning to stillness without fully waking. Their small movements echoed the rhythm of the household, a living testimony to the cyclical nature of daily life. Even in repose, they were part of the measured order that governed the home. Outside, the sounds of the settlement were faint but persistent, the occasional low call of an animal, the soft scrape of earth as creatures moved unseen, and the whispering wind threading through grass and stone. Night absorbed all else, folding the world into quiet layers, leaving only subtle signs of life. The empire, though immense and imposing in distant lands, remained irrelevant here. Authority was abstract, measured only by the passing of days and seasons. Survival depended not on distant power but on careful attention, on repetition, and on quiet endurance. Through these long, unhurried hours, the household persisted. The ordinary day had concluded, yet its effects lingered: warmth in the fire, the echo of labor in stiffened muscles, and the subtle imprint of life's rhythm across every object and every corner. Night pressed on, steady and unchanging, as the family remained within its protective, silent embrace. Night had deepened further, becoming a quiet, expansive presence that wrapped the household and settlement alike. The stars glimmered faintly, scattered across the sky like distant, unapproachable lanterns. Their cold light contrasted with the warmth lingering in the clay walls and the faint glow of the hearth, creating a small pocket of life in a vast, dark world. The man lay still on the woven mat, his body heavy with the residue of the day's labor. Even in rest, he remained alert to subtle changes: a shift in the wind, the distant stir of an animal, the occasional sigh of a child. This awareness was automatic, built over years of reliance on routine and proximity, a silent acknowledgement of responsibility and care. The woman moved quietly, performing a final check of provisions and ensuring that everything for the next day was in order. Her movements were slow and careful, guided by habit and memory. Pots were shifted, cloths folded, and embers stirred into soft heat that would persist through the night. Each action carried a quiet purpose, bridging the work of the day with the demands of tomorrow. The children remained curled in their small corner, their breathing deep and even. Occasionally, one shifted slightly, pressing against a sibling or adjusting the blanket, but these movements were gentle, unhurried, and soon settled back into stillness. In their quiet, they absorbed the rhythm of the household, internalizing the patterns of care and endurance that defined life at the settlement's edge. Outside, the night remained steady. Trees swayed softly in the wind, grasses whispered against one another, and animals moved silently in the distance. The village itself seemed to exist only as a collection of shapes, walls, and faint lights, all muted under the weight of night. Even human presence was reduced to subtle sounds, nearly swallowed by the dark. The empire, vast and distant, held no sway here in the tangible sense. Its reach was felt only in laws and expectations that touched these lands infrequently, leaving daily life governed instead by the cycles of sun and moon, labor and rest. The family's survival depended on attentiveness, endurance, and knowledge of their immediate environment, rather than on decrees from afar. Time seemed suspended. The ordinary day had passed, yet its trace lingered in the house, the fields, and the bodies of those within. Night pressed close, enveloping the settlement and its people in quiet, unbroken continuity, carrying the world toward the hours before dawn. As midnight approached, the world outside became nearly imperceptible. Darkness enveloped the settlement completely, leaving only faint glimmers of starlight to mark the distant horizon. The air was cool, carrying scents of damp earth and lingering smoke, blending with the faint warmth that remained inside the house from the dying embers of the fire. The man lay still, listening to the quiet rhythm of the household. Each breath, each movement, each shift of the blankets was noted unconsciously. His body, heavy with fatigue yet rested enough to endure, reflected the day's labor. The tasks completed and the routines observed left a subtle imprint on muscles and mind, a silent testament to endurance. The woman moved cautiously, attending to small matters in the dim light. She ensured that the hearth remained safe, that food was stored properly, and that all tools were in their place. Her motions were measured, conserving energy while maintaining the household's readiness for the hours yet to come. The children slept deeply, their small bodies rising and falling with steady breath. Even in sleep, they were woven into the rhythm of the household, their presence a quiet marker of continuity and responsibility. Occasionally, a small sigh escaped or a hand twitched, but they remained largely motionless. Outside, the village was still. Animal calls were rare, wind gusts moved only occasionally, and distant fires cast faint, flickering glows on far walls. The settlement existed in a gentle, suspended hush, each sound amplified by the quiet of the night. The empire, massive and powerful in distant lands, exerted no tangible influence here. Its authority was abstract, represented only by routine taxes, occasional soldiers, and edicts that seldom reached these outer edges. Daily life was governed by immediate needs, the cycle of labor, rest, and survival. Time lost its urgency. Midnight passed quietly, unmarked except by subtle shifts in the air and the gradual movement of stars across the sky. The ordinary day had left its trace in the household, in the worn mats, the scattered tools, the softened bread, and the muscles shaped by effort. Night carried them forward gently, preparing the world for the return of dawn. The night stretched deeper, folding the settlement into silence. The stars shone faintly, cold points of light that seemed distant and unreachable. Shadows merged with the darkness around walls, trees, and earth, creating shapes that were indistinct yet familiar. The air remained cool, with only the faintest rustle of leaves or the occasional whisper of wind to break the hush. Inside, the man shifted slightly on the woven mat, feeling the stiffness in his limbs from the day's labor. His eyes, half closed, followed no specific movement, he simply absorbed the quiet, the rhythm of breathing, the soft impressions of presence in the small space. Each sound was catalogued and noted unconsciously, the subtle creak of the walls, the occasional shifting of a blanket, the distant echo of life beyond the house. The woman moved sparingly, ensuring that the hearth's embers would last through the night. She arranged a small container of water and checked the storage of food, not from urgency but from habit, a final act of care that preserved the household's order. Her motions were slow and deliberate, leaving traces of warmth and presence in each carefully executed gesture. The children slept, curled in the corners of the room or against one another. Their small movements punctuated the night with softness, a twitch of a hand, the quiet shift of a leg, a muffled sigh. They rested deeply, absorbing the day's lessons silently, learning the rhythms of household life without instruction. Outside, the settlement lay still. Animals rested, paths were empty, and distant fires cast minimal glow across the terrain. Even the wind had softened, moving in gentle, intermittent bursts that stirred grass and trees without urgency. The village existed as a collection of hushed shapes, quiet presences bound together by shared endurance and routine. The empire's authority remained invisible here, irrelevant to immediate survival. Its vastness was known only in abstraction, distant and unperceivable in the quiet depth of night. Life at the edge of its reach was governed by observation, care, and repetition, the subtle rules of survival shaped by daily experience rather than decree. Time felt suspended, measured only by the slow cooling of air, the faint movements within the household, and the steady march of stars overhead. The ordinary day had concluded, leaving traces in bodies, objects, and the soft warmth of hearth and human presence. Night carried the settlement forward gently, its calm persistence a quiet mirror to the labor and endurance of those within. In the heart of the night, the settlement lay completely still. Darkness enveloped the houses, fields, and low hills beyond, leaving only the faint glimmer of stars above to mark the passage of time. The air was cool, scented faintly with damp earth and the residual smoke from distant hearths, a reminder of life continuing quietly across the land. The man remained on the woven mat, half resting, half vigilant. Though his body was weary, he absorbed the subtle movements and sounds around him, the gentle shifting of blankets, the soft breathing of children, and the faint rustle of the wind outside. His awareness was habitual, built from years of tending both land and household, a quiet exercise in attentiveness that required no conscious effort. The woman moved minimally, attending to the hearth's faint embers and the organization of provisions for the following day. Each motion was deliberate, conserving energy while ensuring the household remained ready for the approaching dawn. She smoothed cloths, adjusted blankets, and gently shifted tools and utensils into familiar arrangements, leaving small markers of care that would guide the morning's tasks. The children slept soundly, their bodies rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. Occasionally, one stirred slightly, pressing a small hand against a sibling or adjusting the blanket, but they returned immediately to stillness. Even in sleep, they remained a part of the household's rhythm, learning the subtle patterns of care and survival through observation and presence. Outside, the village remained hushed. Animals rested, and the faintest movements of wildlife passed almost unnoticed. Fires in neighboring homes glowed dimly, their smoke drifting upward in thin, silent columns. The wind whispered through grasses and trees, barely audible over the profound stillness. The empire, vast and far-reaching, had no tangible presence here. Authority was abstract, distant, and largely irrelevant. Life at the settlement's edge was determined by immediate needs, by labor, observation, and continuity. The household's survival depended not on edicts but on careful attention, measured effort, and the quiet endurance of daily routines. Time seemed suspended. The ordinary day had left its mark, in the warmth of embers, the tired muscles of the adults, the small movements of sleeping children, and the familiar arrangement of tools and provisions. Night carried the family forward, steady and unchanging, preserving the rhythm of life until the first hints of dawn would return. The night pressed on, deep and uninterrupted. Darkness dominated the settlement, folding walls, fields, and distant hills into a quiet, indistinct expanse. Stars, faint but steady, traced their slow paths across the sky, distant witnesses to the life below. The air was cool, carrying faint traces of smoke, damp earth, and the residual warmth of the day, blending together in subtle layers. The man remained largely motionless, lying on the woven mat with the weight of the day's labor settling fully into his limbs. Even in rest, his awareness persisted quietly, the soft rise and fall of his children's breathing, the faint whisper of wind moving through the grass, and the distant hum of life in neighboring homes. Vigilance had become instinct, an unspoken rhythm integrated into the body and mind. The woman moved softly, checking provisions and smoothing blankets. Her motions were minimal yet deliberate, conserving energy while maintaining order. She stirred the faint embers in the hearth, ensuring warmth without firelight becoming overwhelming. Every gesture carried purpose, a silent preparation for the arrival of morning that would inevitably follow this long night. The children slept with gentle steadiness, their small bodies curled in quiet shapes. Occasionally, one shifted slightly, pressing a hand against a sibling, but these movements were minimal and quickly settled. Even in sleep, their presence reinforced the household's pattern of quiet endurance and silent observation, absorbing the rhythms of life without words. Outside, the village seemed suspended. Fires flickered faintly in distant homes, animals rested in their enclosures, and the wind whispered through trees and grass with soft, intermittent movements. The quiet was near complete, punctuated only by subtle, natural sounds that reminded the household of life continuing beyond the walls. The empire, immense yet distant, exerted no tangible influence in this hour. Its authority was abstract, felt only through infrequent edicts or the occasional visit of officials. Life here was dictated by the immediate, by routines of labor, care, and survival, rather than distant power. The household existed in this quiet orbit, self-contained and dependent on attentiveness rather than decree. Time slowed almost imperceptibly. The ordinary day had passed, leaving traces in bodies, objects, and the warmth lingering from labor and hearth. Night continued, steady and unchanging, carrying the family through hours of darkness, preparing them for the return of light. Deep into the night, the settlement lay under a blanket of quiet darkness. Stars scattered across the sky cast faint, cold light, barely illuminating the earth below. Shadows merged with walls, trees, and uneven ground, erasing details but leaving the sense of presence intact. The air was cool, scented faintly with smoke, soil, and the lingering warmth of the day, a subtle mixture that spoke of life continuing even in silence. The man rested on the woven mat, his body relaxed yet alert. Years of labor had trained him to notice the smallest shifts, the sigh of wind through grasses, a distant animal moving unseen, the subtle sounds of the household as blankets shifted or embers glowed. Awareness had become instinct, a quiet extension of himself even in rest. The woman moved sparingly, tending the fading embers of the hearth and ensuring that food and water were stored carefully. Her gestures were minimal, conserving energy while maintaining the household's order. She folded cloths, arranged simple tools, and performed each action with deliberate precision, maintaining readiness for the approaching day without breaking the stillness. The children slept quietly, their bodies curled against each other or lying in corners. Every shift, every sigh, was gentle and measured, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of the household. Through their quiet presence, they absorbed the patterns of care, endurance, and observation that defined life at the edge of the empire. Outside, the village was almost entirely silent. Fires burned low in distant homes, animals rested, and the wind whispered sporadically through the grass and trees. The night held everything in a steady hush, stretching the boundaries of space and time. The empire, vast and far away, exerted no tangible influence here. Life was dictated by immediate needs, attention, labor, and persistence. Authority was internalized through routine, habit, and shared understanding rather than distant edicts. The household's survival depended entirely on quiet vigilance and measured care. Time became almost irrelevant. The ordinary day had left traces: warmth in the fire, the weariness of muscles, the careful placement of objects. Night carried the family through these hours with a slow, steady rhythm, holding them in quiet continuity until the first signs of dawn would return. As the night deepened further, the settlement was draped in near total darkness. Only the faint glimmer of stars marked the passage of time, distant and cold, their light filtering weakly through the still air. Shadows clung to every corner, blending walls, trees, and the earth into a muted tapestry of shapes that shifted subtly with the wind. The man remained on his mat, his body resting yet aware. Even in sleep, his senses quietly catalogued the world around him, the soft sigh of a distant animal, the gentle rustle of grasses, and the occasional creak from neighboring homes. Vigilance had become second nature, a rhythm that persisted even when exhaustion demanded pause. The woman moved softly, performing small tasks in the dim glow of embers. She checked provisions, adjusted blankets, and ensured that the faint warmth of the hearth would continue to provide comfort through the night. Each gesture was deliberate, conserving energy while sustaining the household's order and readiness. The children slept soundly, their presence quietly anchoring the household. Slight movements, a hand shifting, a leg curling, occurred almost imperceptibly, returning immediately to stillness. Even in sleep, they were participants in the quiet rhythm of the home, absorbing lessons of endurance and routine without instruction. Outside, the village was hushed. Fires burned low, distant animals moved minimally, and the wind whispered intermittently through trees and grasses. The night stretched in a continuous, unbroken silence, wrapping the settlement in a protective stillness. The empire, immense and far-reaching, held no tangible sway here. Authority existed only as distant concept, irrelevant to immediate survival. Life was governed by observation, care, and measured action, the subtle laws of routine rather than decree. Time moved imperceptibly. The ordinary day had left its mark in every object, every corner, and every body. Night carried the household onward, steady and persistent, preserving the rhythm of life and preparing them, without ceremony, for the inevitable return of light. The night deepened, folding the settlement into layers of quiet and shadow. The stars, now brighter as the sky darkened further, traced slow paths across the heavens. Their cold, distant light mingled subtly with the faint warmth lingering in the clay walls and the dying embers of hearth fires. The air carried the faint scent of smoke, earth, and residual heat from the day, a silent reminder that life continued despite darkness. The man lay on his mat, muscles finally relaxing after the day's labor, yet his awareness remained tuned to subtle changes. He listened to the soft breathing of the children, the faint shifting of the woman as she adjusted blankets, and the occasional whisper of wind through trees and grasses. Even in stillness, his body and mind retained the rhythm of vigilance, shaped by necessity and habit. The woman moved sparingly, attending to the hearth and small tasks that ensured the household's order through the night. She shifted pots, folded cloth, and arranged simple items with careful attention, balancing the need for readiness with the quiet demands of darkness. Her movements were slow, deliberate, conserving energy while maintaining continuity. The children slept in peaceful repose, curled against each other or on mats. Their soft breaths and occasional movements blended into the household's rhythm, reinforcing a sense of continuity and safety. Even in sleep, they absorbed the lessons of endurance, observation, and care that defined life at the settlement's edge. Outside, the village lay almost completely silent. Fires burned low in distant homes, animals rested, and the wind carried subtle whispers through grasses and trees. The landscape existed as shapes and sounds barely perceptible, a muted echo of the day's activity. The empire's reach remained abstract, distant, and largely irrelevant. Here, survival depended on attentiveness, habit, and shared understanding rather than decrees or distant authority. Life was measured by observation, routine, and the quiet persistence of care. Time seemed suspended, marked only by the slow passing of stars and the soft echo of the household's presence. The ordinary day's labor and routines lingered in the air, in muscles, and in the careful arrangement of tools and provisions. Night carried the family forward gently, holding them in a quiet, continuous rhythm until the first signs of dawn approached. The night had reached its most profound hours. Darkness enveloped the settlement, wrapping walls, fields, and distant hills into a seamless shadow. Stars shone coldly above, scattered across the sky, distant and unyielding, marking time without urgency. The air was cool and still, carrying faint hints of smoke, damp earth, and the lingering warmth of the day. The man lay quietly on his mat, exhausted yet attentive. His body was heavy from the day's labor, but his senses remained alive to subtle changes, a soft stir of wind through the grasses, the distant call of an animal, the faint sigh of the house settling around him. This quiet vigilance had become instinct, a silent pattern embedded over years of tending the household and land. The woman moved minimally, performing small, deliberate tasks by the faint glow of the hearth embers. She ensured provisions were secure, blankets smoothed, and tools arranged carefully for the morning. Every action was purposeful, conserving energy while preserving the rhythm and order of the household. The children slept soundly, their breaths slow and even. Occasionally, a small movement, a hand shifting, a leg curling, punctuated the stillness, but each returned quickly to repose. Their presence, even in sleep, maintained the household's rhythm, a subtle continuation of the day's lessons of care and observation. Outside, the village remained hushed. Fires flickered dimly in distant homes, animals rested in quiet enclosures, and the wind whispered gently through the grasses and trees. Every sound, subtle though it was, emphasized the profound stillness that enveloped the settlement. The empire, vast and distant, held no immediate sway here. Its authority was abstract, irrelevant to the household's survival. Life was dictated by attention, routine, and measured action, the quiet, persistent laws of labor and care rather than distant decrees. Time lost its urgency in these hours. The ordinary day had left traces in the warmth of the hearth, the weariness of bodies, the careful placement of tools, and the arrangement of provisions. Night carried the family onward, steady and unchanging, until the first hints of dawn would signal the return of light and the renewal of daily labor. The night deepened further, and the settlement seemed suspended in a world of shadows and stillness. Stars shone steadily overhead, their faint, cold light illuminating only the outlines of walls, trees, and uneven ground. The air was cool and still, carrying whispers of earth, smoke, and lingering warmth from the day. The man lay quietly, muscles finally surrendering to rest but senses still alert. He noticed the faint creak of a door hinge, the soft sigh of the wind through the grass, and the subtle, rhythmic breathing of the children. Vigilance was ingrained, a silent awareness that required no conscious thought, as necessary as breathing. The woman moved sparingly, tending the faint glow of embers in the hearth and making sure the household's provisions were secure. Each gesture was precise, conserving energy while maintaining order. She folded cloths, shifted small items, and adjusted blankets, leaving subtle traces of care that would guide the household in the coming morning. The children remained asleep, bodies curled in quiet repose. Even in slumber, they were attuned to the household's rhythms, absorbing patterns of care, endurance, and quiet observation without words. Occasional small movements punctuated the stillness but quickly returned to rest. Outside, the village rested. Fires burned low in distant homes, animals slept, and the wind whispered intermittently through trees and grass. The landscape seemed paused, holding its breath in the stillness of night. The empire, though vast and imposing, remained abstract and remote. Authority had no immediate effect here, life was shaped by labor, routine, and attentiveness to the household and land. Survival was dictated not by distant power, but by the quiet persistence of observation, care, and endurance. Time was unmeasured, flowing with the gentle rhythm of the night. The ordinary day's work lingered in the warmth of hearth and body, the careful arrangement of tools, and the steady patterns of life within the household. Night carried them forward, calm and unbroken, until the slow approach of dawn. The hours of night stretched on, dense and unbroken. Darkness enveloped the settlement completely, leaving only the faint sparkle of stars to remind the household of the vast sky above. The air was cool, carrying subtle scents of earth, smoke, and the lingering warmth of the day, blending into an invisible layer of continuity. The man lay still on his mat, his body heavy from labor, yet his awareness remained quietly alive. He listened to the soft, measured breaths of the children, the faint shifting of blankets, and the occasional stir of wind outside. Even in rest, vigilance persisted, a quiet extension of years spent maintaining both land and household. The woman moved minimally, tending to the hearth and checking provisions for the coming day. Her gestures were slow and deliberate, smoothing blankets, shifting small tools, and ensuring food and water were secure. Each motion was purposeful, preserving the household's order and continuity while maintaining stillness. The children slept soundly, their small forms curled or pressed together, breathing in the slow rhythm of the night. Occasional movements, a twitch, a sigh, punctuated the quiet, yet the overall impression remained one of stillness and calm. Even in sleep, they absorbed the household's unspoken lessons of attention, care, and endurance. Outside, the settlement remained hushed. Fires in neighboring homes glowed dimly, animals rested in near silence, and the wind moved sporadically, rustling grasses and trees without urgency. The world seemed folded in layers of quiet, marking a gentle contrast to the effort-filled hours of the day. The empire, distant and vast, exerted no tangible influence here. Its authority remained abstract, irrelevant to the household's immediate survival. Life was shaped by immediate needs, care, observation, routine, and endurance. These were the rules that governed the settlement, subtle yet powerful. Time felt suspended, measured only by faint shifts of the air, slow movements within the house, and the distant motion of stars across the night sky. The ordinary day had left traces, in muscles, in warmth, in the quiet placement of objects, and night carried the family forward, steady, unbroken, and patient, awaiting the return of light. The settlement remained steeped in darkness, the night thick and all-encompassing. Stars gleamed faintly, their scattered light cold and distant, barely illuminating the contours of the earth below. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of smoke, soil, and the residual warmth from the day. Each sound, subtle and sparse, was amplified by the profound silence. The man lay quietly on his mat, body finally surrendering fully to rest, though his awareness remained gently tuned to the household. He registered the soft sighs of sleeping children, the occasional stir of the woman adjusting blankets, and the distant whisper of wind through grasses. Even in rest, instinctual vigilance persisted, a quiet companion shaped by years of tending land and life. The woman moved carefully, ensuring the hearth's embers glowed faintly and that provisions were secure. Each action was deliberate, folding cloths, arranging simple tools, and adjusting blankets with minimal effort. Her movements reinforced order and comfort, preserving the household's rhythm without disturbing the stillness. The children remained in deep sleep, their small bodies curled or pressed together, breathing slowly and evenly. Occasional small movements punctuated the quiet, but quickly returned to calm. Their presence, even in repose, contributed to the household's continuity and the unspoken lessons of attention, endurance, and care. Outside, the village lay dormant. Fires in distant homes glowed dimly, animals rested quietly, and the wind whispered sporadically through trees and grasses. The settlement seemed suspended, wrapped in a quiet that absorbed both time and movement. The empire, though immense and powerful elsewhere, exerted no immediate influence here. Life was shaped entirely by local rhythms, labor, care, observation, and persistence. These unspoken rules governed the household and the settlement with a steady, almost imperceptible force. Time became fluid, measured by subtle shifts in the air, quiet movements within the household, and the slow passage of stars overhead. The ordinary day's labors lingered in bodies, hearths, and tools, while the night carried the family forward in unbroken, gentle continuity, waiting for the first signs of dawn. Night had deepened to its most profound quiet, a stillness so complete that every subtle sound, the soft sigh of a blanket, the slow exhalation of a sleeping child, the faint rustle of wind, seemed amplified. Stars hung like distant lanterns in the sky, cold and unmoving, marking time with gentle constancy. The man lay resting, body heavy from the day's labor but alert in instinct. He noticed the faint shifts in the room, a blanket adjusting, a child's quiet movement, the faint heat radiating from the hearth embers. Years of labor and care had trained him to attend to these subtleties even while resting, an unconscious vigilance that ensured the household's survival. The woman moved minimally, performing necessary small tasks by the dim glow of embers. She checked provisions, adjusted blankets, and made slight corrections to the arrangement of household tools. Each action was deliberate and quiet, preserving comfort and readiness without disturbing the stillness of the hour. The children slept deeply, bodies curled and breathing slow. Occasionally, a hand or foot shifted, or a soft sigh escaped, but they quickly returned to motionless rest. Even in sleep, they absorbed the patterns of attention, care, and routine that defined life in this small corner of the empire. Outside, the settlement rested. Fires flickered low in distant homes, animals lay in quiet repose, and the wind whispered intermittently through grasses and trees. The village existed in muted layers, a quiet reflection of the day that had passed. The empire's authority was distant and abstract, irrelevant to the immediate survival and rhythm of life here. Daily existence was shaped by observation, care, and endurance, the quiet, persistent laws of labor and habit rather than distant edicts. Time seemed suspended. The ordinary day had left its traces in every corner, the warmth of embers, the soft weight of worn muscles, the careful placement of tools and provisions. Night carried the household onward, steady, unbroken, and gentle, awaiting the inevitable approach of dawn. The first faint light began to stir at the edges of the horizon, a pale wash of gray slowly replacing the deep darkness of night. Shadows, long and indistinct, softened as the sky brightened imperceptibly. The air was cooler now, carrying the subtle scent of dew on earth and the faint warmth retained from the day before. The man stirred slightly, sensing the shift in light and air. His body, still heavy from the day's labor, responded to the subtle changes of the night transitioning into morning. Instinct, honed over years, guided him to observe the household, the sleeping children, the woman adjusting blankets, the fading embers in the hearth, and prepare, in small ways, for the day to come. The woman moved carefully, arranging the hearth, checking stored food, and tidying small tools. Her motions were deliberate and quiet, maintaining the household's readiness while the outside world began to awaken. She understood that the first hours of light demanded patience and attention, and her actions reflected the continuity of life through repeated, careful routine. The children remained curled in sleep, gradually responding to the approaching light with small, stretching movements. Their breathing shifted subtly, drawing in the freshness of the early air, preparing bodies and minds for the awakening of labor and routine that would follow. Outside, the settlement began to awaken slowly. Faint glows appeared in distant homes, animals shifted in their enclosures, and the wind carried subtle sounds of movement through trees and grass. Nature itself marked the transition, as if the day was measured by a collective inhalation before labor resumed. The empire, distant and abstract, remained irrelevant in these first hours. Life here was shaped entirely by local rhythms, work, care, observation, and the persistence of daily routine. Authority was expressed not by distant power, but through the intimate knowledge and practices that allowed survival at the edge of the empire. Time returned gradually, measured by light and movement. The ordinary day awaited, ready to unfold once more. The household, nurtured by rest, warmth, and routine, stood prepared to meet it, steady, persistent, and enduring. Dawn continued to spread across the horizon, softening the night's shadows and bathing the settlement in a gentle, diffused light. The sky, tinged with pale pink and gray, reflected subtly on the walls and the uneven earth, revealing textures that had been hidden in darkness. The man rose slowly, stretching stiff muscles, aware of the return of the sun's light and the subtle shift in air and sound. His movements were deliberate, attuned to the rhythms of the household. He checked the hearth embers, feeling the residual warmth, and prepared himself for the tasks that would mark the beginning of the day. The woman moved with quiet efficiency, tending to the last embers of the hearth and arranging stored provisions. She smoothed blankets, folded cloths, and ensured the children would awaken comfortably. Her actions were gentle yet purposeful, maintaining continuity between the night's rest and the day's labor. The children stirred gradually, stretching and yawning, awakening to the soft light and warmth that filtered into the house. Their small movements were careful, still influenced by the calm of night, but the day's routine was beginning to take shape within their awareness. Outside, the village was coming to life. Faint smoke drifted from neighboring hearths, animals began to stir, and subtle sounds of labor, a footstep, a tool, a distant call, marked the slow awakening of the settlement. The air carried a mix of coolness from the night and the promise of warmth from the returning sun. The empire, distant and abstract, remained only a shadow in the background, irrelevant to the immediate concerns of the household. Life was dictated by the practical realities of survival, care, observation, and the deliberate repetition of routine. Authority existed in the household itself, measured by attention, endurance, and action. Time unfolded gradually. The ordinary day was poised to begin anew, the patterns of labor and care resuming seamlessly from the night's rest. The household, steady and prepared, stood ready to continue its quiet, enduring rhythm at the edge of the empire. The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the settlement, revealing textures and colors hidden in the dimness of night. The air carried the fresh scent of earth, faint smoke, and morning dew, signaling the start of another day filled with labor and continuity. The man moved purposefully, gathering tools and preparing to work the land. His body, still carrying the residual stiffness of the previous day, responded with practiced efficiency. Each action was deliberate, guided by experience and the unspoken understanding of what the day demanded. The woman attended to the hearth, preparing the first meal of the day. She arranged food carefully, tending both to sustenance and the household's comfort. Her movements were fluid yet measured, reflecting a day-to-day rhythm that had been honed over years of repetition and observation. The children arose slowly, rubbing eyes and stretching, gradually becoming part of the household's morning rhythm. Their small bodies adjusted to the light and warmth, participating unconsciously in the patterns of work and care that defined life at the settlement's edge. Outside, the village stirred. Animals moved with quiet purpose, smoke from distant hearths trailed upward, and neighbors began to appear along the paths, attending to their own tasks. The settlement, once hushed under night's weight, was now alive with small motions and sounds, yet the calm continuity of life persisted. The empire, vast and abstract, remained irrelevant here. Its presence was distant, a backdrop to the immediate necessities of survival and routine. Authority was experienced not through distant power, but through observation, attention, and the careful management of daily labor. Time resumed its rhythm, measured by the rising sun and the return of activity. The ordinary day unfolded once more, seamlessly connected to the night that had preceded it. The household, nourished by rest, vigilance, and care, moved forward steadily, embodying endurance, order, and the quiet persistence of life at the edge of the empire. The day unfolded fully, sunlight spilling over the settlement, illuminating walls, paths, and fields. Warmth spread gradually, stirring life in every corner of the household and village. The ordinary routines resumed: labor, care, observation, and quiet endurance, each task flowing seamlessly from the night's rest. The man worked steadily, tending the land, adjusting tools, and performing necessary chores with the practiced rhythm of one accustomed to repetition. His movements were efficient, guided by experience and the deep understanding of how survival depended on attention and effort. The day's labor was both physical and measured, a continuation of the patterns established long before. The woman moved gracefully through the household, preparing meals, checking provisions, and attending to small tasks that preserved order and comfort. Each gesture reflected years of learned habits, subtle yet essential. Her attention to detail ensured the household functioned smoothly, bridging the night's rest with the day's demands. The children participated gradually, mimicking the patterns of their elders in small tasks, observing and absorbing the rhythms of daily life. They learned not through instruction alone, but through presence, the quiet repetition of care, labor, and endurance that defined their world. Outside, the village hummed softly with coordinated movement. Fires glowed faintly, animals stirred, neighbors tended to their routines, and the wind carried faint sounds of activity across the fields. Life at the settlement's edge was sustained by the steady cadence of work and attention, small yet crucial acts that preserved the household and community alike. The empire, vast and distant, remained a background concept, irrelevant to the household's immediate concerns. Its authority existed only as abstract law and distant edict, while survival depended on local knowledge, care, and the continuous practice of daily routines. Time completed its cycle. The ordinary day had begun and would eventually pass, leaving its imprint in warmth, weariness, and the careful arrangement of tools and provisions. The household endured, steady and persistent, carried forward by the continuity of life itself. The circle of day and night, labor and rest, vigilance and repose, had completed its turn once more, unremarkable to the world beyond, yet entirely essential within these walls.